Hey everybody, this video is called Thank You Jonathan, and tonight we're continuing our pass-through study here in the book of 1 Samuel, where we're going to be looking at the 14th chapter, where we're going to look at Jonathan defeating the Philistines. And now, this chapter, a lot of times when preachers go through it expository-wise, they break it down into two different teachings. It's a very lengthy chapter, so I'm going to try to be best I can for time's sake, but I'm not going to cut time to 15 minutes to get through the whole chapter, whatever it takes. But chapter 14 verse 1 through 3 says, "Now it happened one day that Jonathan the son of Saul said to the young man who bore his armor, 'Come, let us over to the Philistines' garrison that is on the other side.' But he did not tell his father. And Saul was sitting in the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree, which is in Migron. The people who were with him were about 600 men. Ahijah, the son of Ahitub, Ichabod's brother, the son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh, was wearing an ephod, but the people did not know that Jonathan had gone." So at this point, Jonathan and his arm bearer left the Israelite camp to approach the Philistine outposts. And when you see the word garrison in the Bible, if you weren't in the military, garrison pretty much means a group of a large group. And in our military, a garrison would be considered your home base, where you're stationed at. And the pomegranate tree were common to Israel's landscape and normally grew as low shrubs with spreading branches. And this may have been a particularly large pomegranate tree that's written in verse 2. And Ahijah was the great-grandson of the high priest Eli, and his name meant brother of the Lord. And if you go back to chapter 2, verse 22 through 30, it shows that Eli's house had been rejected by the Lord. And in case you didn't know, back in the book of Exodus, you learn this thing called an ephod, and it's a white garment that was worn by the priest that would be attached to the body with a belt. And a breastplate worn over an ephod had pouches that were used by the priests to carry certain devices used in determining God's will, such as the Urim and Thummim, or sacred lots. And if you don't remember what lots are, lots is when you think of rolling things and choosing, getting an answer by those things, such as today, what would be more common if we did lots would probably be dice. 1 means yes, 2 means no. But while Saul was sitting under the tree, while his son Jonathan boldly went over to the Philistine garrison, Saul and the priests sat back while Jonathan bravely trusted God. And Jonathan didn't go for personal glory, as he told no one he was going. And verse 4 and 5 says, "Between the passes by which Jonathan sought to go over to the Philistines' garrison, there was a sharp rock on one side and a sharp rock on the other side. And the name of one was Bozez, and the name of the other Seneh. The front of one faced northward opposite Michmash, and the other southward opposite Gibeah." So Bozez and Seneh are Hebrew terms, and Bozez, may mean slippery, while Seneh means thorny. And if Jonathan never decided to go to the Philistines' garrison on the other side, he would have never found this strategic place. And God guided Jonathan as he boldly trusted God and acted on that bold trust. And verse 6 and 7 says, "Then Jonathan said to the young man who bore his armor, 'Come, let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised, that it may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few.' So the armor bearer said to him, 'Do all that in your heart. Go then, here I am with you according to your heart.'" So uncircumcised was a derogatory term that was used by the Israelites to describe the Philistines. And Jonathan demonstrated great faith that should have been demonstrated by the king. And Israel was greatly outnumbered. They were demoralized, but Jonathan was submissive to God for God using him. And Jonathan's faith was demonstrated by his works. And God's power is never restrained. And God may not act when we walk in unbelief. And Jonathan, he had little faith in himself, but he had great faith in God. And verse 8 through 10 says, Then Jonathan said, Very well, let us cross over to these men, and we will show ourselves to them. If they say thus to us, Wait until we have come to you, then we will stand in our place and not go up to them. But if they say thus, Come up to us, then we will go up. For the Lord has delivered them into our hand, and this will be a sign to us. So Jonathan took his support of his armor bearer. And Jonathan takes a step of faith by proposing a test that's based on the response of the Philistine guards, as he really wanted to know if God was really leading. And he shows wisdom as he asked God to guide him. And Jonathan didn't doubt a word from God. He doubted, though, his heart and mind. And he was prompted by faith. And this was an unusual manner for determining the Lord's will, but not without similar precedent of Gideon's fleece, which we looked at back about 3 months ago in the book of Judges, chapter 6. And Jonathan was allowed to determine the will of God by the reactions of his enemies. In verse 11 through 14 says, So both of them showed themselves to the garrison of the Philistines, and the Philistines said, Look, the Hebrews are coming out of the holes where they have hidden. Then the men of the garrison called to Jonathan and his armor bearer and said, Come up to us and we will show you something. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, Come up after me, for the Lord has delivered them into the hand of Israel. And Jonathan climbed up on his hands and knees with his armor bearer after him, and they fell before Jonathan. And as he came after him, his armor bearer killed them. That first slaughter which Jonathan and his armor bearer made was about 20 men within a half acre of land. So you notice in verse 11, the term of Hebrews is used. And it's the oldest term used by the Gentile nations to refer to the people of Israel. And many of the Israelites were hiding in fear over the battle. And apparently they thought that Jonathan and his arm bearer were Israelite deserters that were coming to the Philistine side. And I wonder if the Philistines thought that they were surrendering themselves over. In verse 15 says, And there was a trembling in the camp, in the field, and among all the people. The garrison and the raiders also trembled, and the earth quaked. So it was a great trembling. And the earthquake affirms the fact of divine intervention aided Jonathan and his armor bearer in their raid. And it brought confusion on the Philistines, and the outnumbering of the Israelites did not matter, or the fact that they had better weapons. And God sent the great earthquake to terrify the Philistines here. In verse 16 through 19 says, Now the watchmen of Saul and Gibeah of Benjamin looked, and there was a multitude melting away, and they went here and there. Then Saul said to the people who were with him, Now call the roll and see who has gone from us. And when they had called the roll, surprisingly, Jonathan and his armor bearer were not there. And Saul said to Ahijah, Bring the ark of God here, for at that time the ark of God was with the children of Israel. Now it happened while Saul talked to the priests that the noise which was in the camp of the Philistines continued to increase. So Saul said to the priests, "Withdraw your hand." And I don't know personally if the Philistine army melted away like snowmen. They might have became Democrats, I don't know. But in the Hebrew, it means that they fainted or that they were consumed. And so maybe you can look at that in a literal meaning that they melted away, but I believe it means that they fainted as they were consumed. And in verse 18, the LXX reads ephod instead of the ark. And this seems more likely as the ark was at Kirjath Jearim, and the language of verse 19 better fits the ephod than the ark. So this can be a scribal or a translational issue, but it does not corrupt the God's word. And you know that there's so many different translations out there. There's probably some translations that will use instead of ark the ephod. And Saul in a hurry ordered the priests to stop the inquiry into the will of the Lord. In verse 20 through 23 says, "Then Saul assembled, and they went into battle, and indeed every man's sword was against his neighbor, and there was a great confusion. Moreover, the Hebrews who were with the Philistines before that time, who went up with them into the camp from the surrounding country, they also joined the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. Likewise, all the men of Israel who had hidden in the mountains of Ephraim, when they heard that the Philistines fled, they also followed hard after them in the battle. So the Lord saved Israel that day, and the battle shifted to Beth Aven." And it took Saul some time to start leading. In the Hebrews, there's a reference to the Israelite deserters or mercenaries, and the mountains of Ephraim were largely partially wooded area that were north and west of Michmash. And the writer here uses very similar language to that of the book of Exodus. And in spite of their disobedient king, God was faithful to deliver Israel from her enemies. And in verse 24 says, "And the men of Israel were distressed that day, for Saul had placed the people under oath, saying, Cursed is the man who eats any food until evening, before I have taken vengeance on my enemies. So none of the people tasted food." So Saul's incompetent leadership failed to provide for the physical needs of his men, and that would leave them weak and fatigued. And Saul's first foolish oath pronounced a curse on anyone that was tasting food until the battle was over. And the scene fits chronologically after Jonathan's departure. And Saul puts the focus of fasting on himself. And he's really overstepping his boundaries of what really wasn't his authority. And Saul's actions brought Israel's army morale down, as when you don't eat and you're burning these calories as a soldier, you're going to have a lack of energy, and it's going to affect the overall mental health of the unit and the motivation of them. And when we look at the verse 24 here, we see legalism, and you know, legalism is a poison among us. There are many churches today, I'm not going to say many, there's many what they call churches today that are wrapped up in legalism, and that is when man adds their own ways to what's written rather than just sticking on the word of God in context. In verse 25 through 30 says, "Now all the people of the land came to a forest, and there was honey on the ground. And when the people had come into the woods, there was the honey dripping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard his father charged the people with the oath. Therefore he stretched out the end of the rod that was in his hand and dipped it in a honeycomb and put his hand to his mouth, and his countenance brightened. Then one of the people said, your father strictly charged the people with an oath, saying, cursed is the man who eats food this day. And the people were faint. But Jonathan said, my father has troubled the land. Look now how my countenance has brightened, because I tasted a little of this honey. How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies, which they found. For now there would not have been a much greater slaughter among the Philistines. So honey on the ground is likely referencing honeycombs here that can be found in a forest. And Jonathan apparently departed before Saul made his oath. And God provides the honey to the tired and hungry army. Yet Saul's foolish oath prevented them from receiving what God has put before their eyes. And we see that Jonathan ate some of the honey, and it did him well immediately. And so we see that Jonathan goes against what his dad has put out. And when he's confronted about it, he's like, my dad's a knucklehead. Why would he make a stupid rule like that? And oftentimes if you have teenagers, they think they know more than you. And if Jonathan was a teenager, then we could say that a teenager was right over his father at this time. But we see that Jonathan saw the foolishness of his father's oath and how it hurts Israel's cause rather than being beneficial at all. And Saul's oath came back to hurt them. And verse 31 through 35 says, now they had driven back the Philistines that day to Michmash, to Ajalon. So the people were very faint. And the people rushed on the spoil and took sheep, oxen, and calves and slaughtered them on the ground. And the people ate them with the blood. And then they told Saul, saying, look, the people are sinning against the Lord by eating with the blood. So he said, you have dwelt treacherously. Roll a large stone to me this day. And Saul said, disperse yourselves among the people, and say to them, bring me here every man's ox and every man's sheep. Slaughter them here and eat. And do not sin against the Lord by eating the blood. So every one of the people brought his ox with him that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord, and this was the first altar that he built to the Lord. So Ajalon, however you say his name was, the town name, was approximately 15 miles west of Michmash, and this would have been a normal path back to the land of the Philistines. And so we see that the people are so severely hungry because of this stupid oath that they disobeyed the law by eating the meat raw and not draining the blood as called for in Leviticus 17 verse 10 through 14. And their obedience to Saul's foolish command led them to disobey God's clearly declared command. And Saul blamed the people for what was really his own fault after he made this foolish commandment. And his commandment provoked the people into sin. And one thing that you're going to find with legalism is that legalism, people are going to rebel more. I mean, look at these work-based groups that, that focus on do this, do that to be right with God, do this, do that. You see a rebellion. I mean, you look at sexual immorality within these different groups of people, for instance, the Catholic Church with kids, just, not too long ago when it was exposed and all that. And Saul ended up setting up a stone to properly butcher the animals and also built an altar to the Lord. And at least he did some of what was right after he did what was wrong, but it would never fix the wrong. And this was the first and only altar that is built by Saul that is mentioned in the scriptures. And so verse 36 through 39 says, Now Saul said, Let us go down to the Philistines by night and plunder them until the morning light, and let us not leave a man of them. And they said, Do whatever seems good to you. Then the priest said, Let us draw near to God here. So Saul asked counsel of God, Shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you deliver them into the land of Israel? But he did not answer them that day. And Saul said, Come over here, all you chiefs of the people, and know and see what the sin was today. For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. But not a man among all the people answered him. So Ahijah the priest requested that they first seek God regarding the course of action. And at his request, Saul inquired of the Lord regarding his battle plan. And because of the sin that Saul has caused the army, we see that God did not answer any of his inquiry. And this wouldn't be the only time or the last time that God would refuse to respond to sinful Saul, as we're going to see again in a few weeks when we're in 1 Samuel 28 verse 6. And as an encore to his previous oath, we see that Saul follows up with another foolish oath, unknowingly jeopardizing his own son's life. In verse 40 through 44 says, Then he said to all Israel, You be on my side, or you be on one side, and my son Jonathan and I will be on the other side. And the people said to Saul, Do what seems good to you. Therefore Saul said to the Lord God of Israel, Give a perfect lot, so that Saul and Jonathan were taken, but the people escaped. And Saul said, Cast lots between my son Jonathan and me. So Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, Tell me what you have done. And Jonathan told him and said, I have tasted a little honey with the end of the rod that was in my hand, so now I may die. So the practice of casting lots was used to distinguish one person or group from another. And Jonathan was indicted as the guilty party, though he may have acted innocently. And they probably used Urim and Thummim as a way to cast their lots, which we know in the Old Testament was the popular way to do so. And Saul was willing to kill his son rather than humbly admit that he was a coward and that he was really at fault. And Saul was proud and he was concerned about his own authority and honor rather than the foolish thing that he did. And he was intent on fulfilling his own vow. And, one thing that we must give to Saul, that, if you make a vow, you need to follow that vow. And he is a man of his word. But at the same time, Saul was acting in pride. In verse 45-46 says, But the people said to Saul, Shall Jonathan die, who has accomplished this great deliverance in Israel? Certainly not. As the Lord lives, not one hair of his head shall fall to the ground. For he has worked with God this day. So the people rescued Jonathan, and he did not die. Then Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, and the Philistines went to their own place. So Jonathan, unlike his father as king, understood the sufficiency of God for the task, and he obediently relied on him for the victory. And the Philistines were left to continue their retreat unhindered. And the people stood up to Saul's foolishness, and they would not allow Jonathan to be executed. And, it's great to see that the people would rise up against the immoral king at this time. And when you rose up against a king figure or whatever, it wasn't like speaking bad about the president, of the United States of America. This would be something that could probably end up where you never see the light of day again, or you are taken out. In verse 47 through 52, we're going to wrap up these verses right here. It says, "So Saul established his sovereignty over Israel and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, against the people of Ammon, against Edom, against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he harassed them, and he gathered an army and attacked the Amalekites, and delivered Israel from the hands of those who plundered them. The sons of Saul were Jonathan, Jeshui, and Malchishua." I like these names. "And the names of his two daughters were these: the name of the firstborn, Merab, and the name of the younger, Michal, whatever it is. The name of Saul's wife was Ahinoam, the daughter of Ahimaaz, and the name of the commander of his army was Abner, the son of Ner, Saul's uncle. Kish was the father of Saul, and Ner was the father of Abner, was the son of Abiel. Now there was a fierce war with the Philistines all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any strong men or any valiant men, he took him for himself." So we see a little kind of like a genealogy that wraps up the chapter here. But Saul's military accomplishments were significantly expanded Israel's borders in all directions to out as far as Edom and Ammon, Moab, Zobah, and Philistia. And the defeat of the Amalekites was recorded, as we're going to see tomorrow as we continue our study here. And Saul's children, Jonathan and Michal, would both play significant roles in the life of the next king, David. And, you know, I liked Saul at the very beginning of this, you know, seeing him as a humble guy. But we see that his true colors start showing. And, you know, at this point in time, I can't wait for King David. And you're going to probably hear me say that again, because Saul was not a good man at all. And nothing further is known about Saul's wife or the children, the other children that are mentioned here. And Abner is a cousin of Saul who commanded his army. And the Philistine opposition to Israel was persistent and continual to the very last day of Saul's life, as we'll look at the wrap up of this book here in the next month or so. And Saul looked for the good warriors, and he attached them to his personal force. And David was one such man who would continue this practice under his rule, as, like I said, we'll be looking at David more through the rest of the Samuels by the end of the year. And matter of fact, I wrote down 2 Samuel 23, verse 8 through 39, so that is definitely at the end of the year. But the next chapter will fully expose the weakness of Saul. And the next chapter, hint, hint, isn't going to be all that much quicker to get through. There is so much content where you could spend a few weeks on going over it. But I break down to very general. And so to wrap up our study here today, we looked at Jonathan's proposal as he found a strategic position. And his proposal was bold, as he proposed a test as his armor bearer and himself attacked the Philistines. And we see, though, that God attacked the Philistines himself. And we see that Saul learned of the battle, and he fought the battle as a great victory is won. And we saw that Saul compelled the army of Israel under the oath to fast. And we see that his vow would be broken by no other than his very own son Jonathan, unknowingly, as he is told after the fact that he violated it. And as a result, the soldiers of Israel sinned because of Saul's foolish command. And we saw that instead of repenting of his foolish oath, that Saul made another foolish oath. And how many times we try to make another decision after a stupid one, and instead of confronting the stupidity of what we did, we go on and become more stupid, you know? It's just the natural man way, I guess. And we saw that Jonathan was implicated by the casting of the crowns and that of the people of Israel. And we see that the people of Israel would rescue Jonathan from execution. They would put on the pardon for him and overstep their submission to the king. And we see that the chapter wraps up speaking of Saul's many wars and his family. And this is the quickest I could get through this chapter. And the next chapter, and you think this is bad, just wait till next week when we look at the most common story in this book of David and Goliath. But that's going to wrap up for today's video. We'll see you next, as we're going to be looking at God's rejection of Saul as king. And we'll be in that study tomorrow in chapter 15. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless, and we'll see you then.